Thank you all for being here. And I think that's really what TCD does is this kind of exchange and bring people together from all over campus. So it's nice to see we have people from all over campus. We have a lot of alumni, we have collaborators, we have a lot of people online. So I hope the logistics of that is working okay. Okay, but I just wanted to just frame why we're having this discussion about how the university can contribute to biocultural conservation by just reminding us that the TCD program has a very long history of working together across disciplines and across institutions in partnership, very often working with local organizations to try and contribute to conservation on the ground. And within TCD, we have recently completed a program on governance and infrastructure in the Amazon that really highlighted the key role of forest and riverine people in effective conservation and governance. Okay. Okay, so some of the lessons from GIA were that grassroots organizations are key actors working in collaboration with other kinds of partners like universities. They use political action and negotiation as key strategies to influence governance. And in our learning network, grassroots leaders were heavily engaged. We learned a lot from each other, but we also learned of the importance of relationships within, even among allies, and partnership as a key element. Okay. And this is a diagram of the learning network that was the methodology that we used to bring together different kinds of organizations in different countries. So we had in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, in different working groups, people from NGOs, academia, grassroots, and social organizations, all to learn together and hopefully to try and empower each other to have more impact. Okay. And to thinking about a next project, that how do we give continuity to that learning network, we formed a working group of some of those partners and consulted them about how they would like to see a future collaboration with the University of Florida. And they sent a very clear message that they wanted to be protagonists of conservation and not beneficiaries or support or, well, they didn't feel like they needed our support, that we needed to support them because they're at the front line of conservation. And we listened to those voices by organizing a conference, and we helped them to articulate a vision of conservation, which aligns with the theory of biocultural conservation. So that's really how we got to this very specific topic. And since then, the key question really was, so what is the university's role in, if these grassroots organizations are frontline conservationists, they have a clear vision, they want to implement, they want support so that they have the resources to implement, what is the role of the university? And so we spent some time reflecting on, first of all, better understanding, because it brought us to the concept of biocultural conservation that not all of us are completely familiar with. So we've done some research by forming a working group of students. So the way we interact and learn together by bringing multiple visions and voices together is exemplified by this working group. And we understood that biocultural conservation is an essential strategy for conservation in the Amazon, and that their key strategies are based on indigenous or community empowerment and protagonism, collaboration and partnership to leverage what they can do, knowledge, and kind of the end goals that they have are rights and governance and management of territories. So thinking of the key things that are necessary for implementing biocultural conservation, and then stepping back, thinking about how the university can contribute to that, we came up with this three-part theory of change that is based on collaboration, and it's actually based on a lot of things that the TCD program does really well. So working together, co-designing and co-implementing, and having that relational equity that the partners demanded in other words, it has to be built into how you work together. And that is really the underlying theory, the underlying dimension for then how together you can incorporate different ways of knowing, bringing academic and non-academic or different disciplines of knowing, different kinds of knowledge, transdisciplinary knowledge. And then that should be aimed at something that is mutually beneficial. If it's a true partnership, it's got to bring direct positive outcomes for all of the partners. And recognizing that building capacity so that these partners can impact governance and territorial management in the future is part of those direct outcomes. But for our understanding of biocultural conservation to be in effect, it has to have all of these components, and these components interact with each other. And so we have actually written a paper on this and are sharing it with partners or potential partners like Faisal Moola from the University of Guelph. All right. And others, some of which are online and some of which we consulted to develop that framework for how the academia can contribute. So we're in a process now of sharing our findings and our ideas, thinking about like the next steps for TCD to implement those ideas, what we can do ourselves within our own programs and resources and institutional housing here, but also trying to share these ideas with other academic programs. But also at the same time learning from them. So that's why we have this opportunity today to hear from Dr. Faisal Moola. But we're going to have several other events from with collaborators from the Field Museum, from Simon Fraser University, and from Terralingua coming for next semester. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Faisal Moola, who's a professor in geography at the University of Guelph in near Toronto, Canada. He has a vast experience working in Indigenous-led conservation. From our analysis, we know that Canada is actually a leading country in the development of this discipline. And Dr. Faisal Moola has been a leading actor in the conservation through reconciliation partnership, an integration between academia and universities and Indigenous organizations. So we have a lot to learn from him, and I'm going to pass the word on to Faisal. Thank you. We've already had some tremendous dialogues and discussions with you today, so thank you very much for being here, and we've learned a lot already, and we hope to hear more from your experiences and what we can build together.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Bob. Thanks, everybody. It's been a wonderful morning and afternoon. Real honor to be able to speak at the University of Florida. And the highlight for me was the opportunity to meet a number of different students who are from a remarkable diversity of scholarly backgrounds, but they all are sort of united in this common interest in advancing biocultural forms of conservation, which, as you'll hear in my talk, I sort of see as both a response to the harms of colonial models of conservation, which I'm going to emphasize have actually disenfranchised Indigenous peoples, not only in Canada, but around the world. So you can see it as a response to that, but it's also an opportunity to engage with Indigenous peoples in fostering a resurgence in Indigenous biocultural knowledge and biocultural lifeways. So I want to talk a little, just to give you a little sense of who I am. My name is Faisal. My community originally came from India. We were colonized by the British and brought to South Africa in the early 1800s under a form of indentured labor to cut sugarcane in Natal. So Natal is that region of South Africa on the Indian Ocean. There was about 150,000 indentured laborers that originally came from India, including my family. And it was a very impressive regime, and it's an element of colonialism that we don't tend to pay a lot of attention to, though there are people from India and South Asia all across the world as a consequence of indentured labor in the Caribbean and Polynesian islands, etc. In the 1960s and 1970s, my family and myself were actively involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, which was a system of state racism which disenfranchised and violently oppressed non-whites, including members of the indentured labor community. And my father was the Secretary General of the African National Congress. He worked with Nelson Mandela. But in the 70s, my family had to flee South Africa because of the intensity of violence during the darkest days of apartheid. So we came to Canada as political dissidents, and that's where I made my life. I spent most of my academic career actually working not in universities, but in civil society. I used to be the Secretary General for the largest environmental organization in Canada, but about 5 years ago, joined the University of Guelph's Geography Department to open a biocultural lab, which I call the People, Plants, and Policy Lab. This lab is a partnership of scholars, students, and Indigenous partners, including Indigenous knowledge holders, that are sort of united around three primary goals. The first is document the reciprocal relationship between Indigenous peoples and culturally significant biodiversity. Secondly, to do research on the customary practices of Indigenous peoples in creating and sustaining those relationships. And thirdly, and most notably, to provide science and policy support to Indigenous peoples who are fighting to assert their knowledge systems, rights, and governance in decolonized forms of conservation practice. Now, my talk today is titled The Role of Biocultural Education in Supporting Indigenous-led Conservation. And the reason why I chose this topic is because Indigenous-led conservation is a form of biocultural stewardship. And right now it's gaining significant momentum as an alternative pathway to colonial forms of conservation governance. As my colleague Julia Matalia and our co-authors wrote in a recent paper, the concept of biocultural stewardship emphasizes 2 points. Number one, that biological and cultural diversity are interdependent, tied together via their coexistence, coevolution, and common threats. And secondly, that biodiversity stewardship can be achieved through multiple pathways, not only through strict protection of nature alone. Both elements of biocultural stewardship offer opportunities to advance biocultural education, including innovations in pedagogy within higher ed. But the latter is very important because conservation, including how it is generally taught in scientific disciplines such as conservation biology or ecological science, has largely focused on protection efforts that restrict access to nature, typically in regulated parks and protected areas, and increasingly within market-based conservation practices that too often include the appropriation and commodification of Indigenous peoples and their resources. And that includes things like carbon markets or biodiversity offsets. Now, this colonial form of conservation is rooted in notions of wilderness as being necessarily uninhabited and management expertise being exclusively informed by Western science alone. It too often ignores or downplays the rich ecological knowledge held by Indigenous peoples and local communities with long histories of land use and residency with landscape, and who are the immediate custodians of lands and biocultural lifeways. For example, you may have seen this recent paper that was published in Conservation Letters. It received a lot of media attention, partly because it was one of a much needed example of a conservation success story. In their paper, the authors reported that conservation activities, including intensive practices such as captive breeding and eradication of invasive species, have prevented the extinction as of many as 48 bird and mammal species since 1993. And they argue that their findings are critical to how governments around the world should negotiate new goals for conservation. My colleague Phil Loring and I agreed with the latter point, but we were troubled by a lack of any mention in their paper about Indigenous peoples and their longstanding contributions to conservation around the world, which we emphasized in our own submission to the journal. We argue that this oversight has real ramifications for Indigenous peoples. Research has repeatedly shown that Indigenous peoples are effective stewards of biodiversity, and biodiversity on Indigenous lands regularly matches or in fact exceeds that found in formally designated parks and protected areas. As such, we hypothesized, it is likely that the historical legacy and continued presence of Indigenous peoples is at least partially responsible for the successes discussed in the study and which we must rightfully celebrate. Now, notwithstanding the fact that the emphasis in undergraduate and graduate programs is typically on Western conservation science or Western conservation policy or Western environmental economics, there's an increasing corpus of research that shows that in fact most biodiversity is in fact hosted by Indigenous peoples in areas that are either owned or managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities under customary and traditional systems of governance and land use. For example, in our paper with Julia and our co-authors, we note that Indigenous peoples sustain 37% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically well-conserved landscapes through their dynamic and locally adapted biocultural knowledge systems. Furthermore, unlike mainstream models of conservation, which seek to separate humans from nature, Indigenous-led conservation is rooted in approaches that maintain, strengthen, and rebalance the relationship between humanity and nature, concepts that are at the heart of biocultural stewardship. It is important to remember that Indigenous peoples and local communities have been stewards of biodiversity through their own systems and forms of conservation governance for millennia. This includes the stewardship of sacred groves and other spiritual spaces, as well as customary land use practices that benefit biodiversity, such as cultural burning, as well as traditional aquaculture like clam gardens, hunting, fishing, gardening, and other harvesting technologies. In fact, Indigenous lands and waters have rightfully been described as, quote, territories of life, because their stewardship not only protects non-human biodiversity, but also those elements of cultural diversity that are just as important to Indigenous peoples as well. There's a growing awareness of the importance of such biocultural approaches to conservation, which provides stewardship of both biocultural, biological diversity, and the reciprocal relationships that Indigenous peoples have with their local environment. Such biocultural knowledge is often encoded in Indigenous languages, art, song, dance, and other cultural traditions, as well as the spiritual practices of Indigenous peoples and the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. So my talk today is going to be organized according to 3 spatial scales. I'm going to touch on the local, the national, and the global in terms of interrogating this question on how do we foster biocultural education. I'm going to first introduce the concept of biocultural stewardship at the local scale with an inspiring story of Indigenous-led conservation that I've had the opportunity to witness and in a small way contribute to in one of the most impacted places on the planet. It's not Amazonia, in fact, but rather the ancestral lands and waters of the Danizá indigenous nations of northwestern North America, commonly known as Turtle Island. Secondly, I will briefly describe the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which is an Indigenous-led network across Canada that has brought universities and other academic institutions together with Indigenous peoples to advance Indigenous-led conservation, including biocultural stewardship. And our goal is to radically transform the conservation sector in my country, Canada. And lastly, I will touch on the opportunities to scale biocultural stewardship, including education and capacity building through implementation of global biodiversity policy, namely the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted by nearly 200 countries this time last year at COP15 that was signed in Montreal, Canada. As I proceed, I will emphasize the opportunities for advancing biocultural education and conservation, including potential avenues for innovations in pedagogy. So let us begin. According to a study that was published several years ago in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, there are few places on our planet that have been untouched by modern humans. As reported by Ellis and Ramankudi, some 75% of the Earth's ice-free surface now shows evidence of alteration. because of human residence and human land use, with less than a quarter of the planet remaining as quote-unquote wildlands. From Arctic tundra to primeval rainforest to arid desert, our natural world has been fragmented by ever-expanding towns and cities, crisscrossed with roads, transmission lines, and pipelines, and pockmarked by pump jacks, flare stacks, and other infrastructure used to pump, frack, and strip mine fossil fuels from the ground. The need to supply food, fiber, fuels, shelter, and fresh water to the more than 7 billion of us humans now living on the planet is driving the wholesale conversion of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and other ecosystems, leading to the precipitous decline and disappearance of biodiversity and the degradation of critical ecosystem services that sustain all life on Earth, such as the provision of clean water, healthy soils, and a stable climate. The loss of biodiversity includes so-called cultural keystone species and other biocultural ethnotaxa that were first defined by Garibaldi and Turner, quote, as culturally salient species that shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people as reflected in the fundamental roles these species have in diet, materials, medicines, and spiritual practices. Nowhere is this truer than in northeastern British Columbia. While many cultural keystone species are not at risk of extinction globally, they are often vulnerable to human impacts at local scales, from overharvesting, deforestation, and other threats. As Julia and I and some co-authors argue in our recent paper, their importance of these culturally salient species might decline if cultures that nurture them disappear or fade altogether, or when human languages go extinct. Declines in local access, abundance, or quality of culturally significant species can also adversely impact the customary use of cultural keystone species by Indigenous peoples and local communities. Just want to draw your attention to this. This is just an example of a very sophisticated type of Indigenous technology, which is the creation of dry meat in Denisot territories in northern Canada, where fresh meat is prepared and processed into something like a little bit like beef jerky. And that was a way of keeping meat from rotting, and that could be transported over long distances. Normally, dry meat would be used, the meat used for dry meat would be caribou or elk or moose. In this picture, it's beef bought from the local grocery store. And partly that's because caribou, elk, and moose are no longer accessible to the Denisot. So they've kept the biocultural practice of creating dry meat, but they've had to shift to adapt because of the fact that the species is no longer easily available. Now, the impacts of human land use on nature, including cultural keystone species like caribou, were brought into sharp relief series in a series of maps that were published by Timothy Golden, a researcher at the US Defense Meteorological Satellite Program at NOAA. Golden identified contiguous lighted areas worldwide. So if you look at this map, the light spots, the bright spots on this map reflect sources of light emissions at night. Lit homes, powered factories, illuminated city streets, and other built infrastructure, which now dominates most of the planet. Golden's maps show how much of our planet is now under the direct influence of our ever-expanding human footprint, not just due to urbanization, but also the sprawling growth of energy infrastructure and development in formerly intact areas, such as Canada's boreal forest, which is in the northern latitudes of North America. Nowhere is this truer than in northeastern British Columbia's Peace region, a vast land of boreal forest, rolling grasslands, and majestic rivers, like its namesake, the Peace River. The Peace is an irreplaceable pinch point within the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor in Western North America, and as such, is a conservation priority for protecting core wildlife habitat and animal movement corridors for large migratory mammals like wolves and endangered grizzly bear populations, as well as other culturally significant species. The region is also home to the Denizah and the Cree Indigenous nations, who have lived, hunted, and traded with the Peace Valley and across the entire region for at least 10,000 years. In 1899, the Denizah Indigenous nations signed a peace and friendship treaty with the British Crown. It's called Treaty 8. Treaty 8 enshrined a solemn and binding promise that guaranteed that the Denizah and Cree would be able to continue their traditional activities as to the hunting, trapping, fishing, and other customary practices. For as the treaty so eloquently says, quote, "For as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows." In return for the necessary consent to develop any lands in Denizah territory, the Crown solemnly promised that the practices that Treaty 8 First Nations have continuously maintained for at least 10,000 years will be allowed to continue without forced interference or forced dependency on the Crown. Yet since signing Treaty 8, the Denizah have seen their lands irrevocably damaged by logging, oil and gas extraction, mines, dams, and other resource development. Across their ancestral territories, forestry, energy, mineral leases and licenses are now widespread and multi-layered. As various industries have exploited these industrial tenures, a sprawling patchwork of large clear cuts, oil wells, dams and reservoirs, fracking operations, and thousands of miles of seismic lines, roads, and pipelines have come to dominate the landscape. Several years ago, my colleagues and our partners with the Denizah published the first ever spatial analysis of land use and land use pressures within Denizah territory, an area of 35,000 square miles, about twice the area of Vermont. Within Denizah territory, we found that there are over 16,000 oil and gas wells, over 8,000 petroleum and natural gas facilities. There are over 28,000 miles of roads, 683 miles of transmission lines, and 18,000 miles of oil and gas pipelines. 3/4 of those pipelines are still in operation. If you placed all the pipelines, roads, and seismic lines in Denizah territory end to end, they would extend more than 4.5 times around the circumference of the planet. When you add up all of this development, the aggregate footprint of industrial development within Denizah territories is unprecedented. In fact, the pace and scale of land use and land use development in Denizah territories is greater than perhaps any other intensively managed place on the planet. It's greater than the Athabasca oil sands, which is where the oil sands development is happening. It might in fact be greater than what's happening in Amazonia as well. Today, more than 67% of Denizah territory has felt the impacts of industrial development, leaving little intact habitat for sensitive and imperiled species, including those culturally significant species like caribou. This is an example of a species that is iconic and critically important to Denizah. The Denizah are caribou people. And there's very little place for caribou to feed, breed, or roam. For example, 5 out of the 7 caribou herds that are found within Denizah territories have been diminished by over 50% through a combination of roads, mines, pipelines, settlements, well sites, and other land use development. The bird pine herd was extirpated. It's gone from the planet in 2009, and neighboring herds are now down to less than 50 animals, despite efforts by the federal government to try to recover the species under colonial regulations. But here's the rub. The Denizah, who have relied on caribou as their primary source of food for thousands of years, can no longer hunt them. Moose populations have also crashed, and fish in the rivers of Denizah territories are so tainted with mercury since the Peace River was dammed that they can no longer be eaten safely. The loss of these and other culturally important wildlife has led to the severance of reciprocal relationships between Indigenous peoples and the non-human kin that they share their lands and waters with. And this has had cascading negative impacts on the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. The loss of hunting and fishing rights as a consequence of this development is also an infringement on the Denisah's treaty rights, which are protected under the Canadian Constitution, as well as upheld and enshrined within UN conventions, such as the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly Articles 26 and Articles 29 to 32. At a recent symposium on managing the impacts of resource development in Canada, numerous speakers from Indigenous nations to academics like myself stressed that effectively managing land use and climate change impacts will require new institutions and new governance mechanisms, including reformed models of how we conserve and protect nature to better reflect the priorities of Indigenous peoples. More importantly, it will require our leaders to adopt a much more proactive and holistic view of thinking about the world, one that recognizes that far from just being a place to extract resources like fossil fuels, timber, minerals, nature is our home, nature provides our most fundamental needs, and nature dictates limits to growth, and so its stewardship should be our highest priority. In 2011, the Denisah sent a delegation of elders and youth from northern Canada over 1,500 kilometers to the city of Victoria in southern Canada, which is the home of the British Columbia government. They were there to deliver a declaration drafted on birch bark by the elders calling for the establishment of a 95,000 hectare tribal protected area. This tribal protected area will be established in one of the biggest natural gas plays on the continent. It's called the Montney Shale. There are over 449 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and more than 1 million barrels of oil under the ground where they want to establish this Indigenous protected area. They named this Indigenous protected area Kitsatse. And Kitsatse in the Denisah or Beaver language means old spruce. It's a place of great reverence to the Denisah. It's a sacred place, in part because unlike most boreal forests, which are susceptible to frequent catastrophic fires, Kitsatse seems to have never burned. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of large-scale burns ever there. And I'm told that's because Kitsatse is protected by the Creator. As a consequence, Kitsatse is dominated by exceedingly rare, ancient, old-growth black spruce forests, which are almost unheard of anywhere else in Canada. On one of my most recent trips, the late elder Tommy Atache, who I learned a lot from, told me how he would visit the ancient spruce forests of Kitsatse as a child on horseback. There they would hunt moose and caribou, they would grieve their loved ones, and they would heal their spirits. Tommy told me, quote, "We've been here forever, even before they made the country of Canada. We use it for healing, spiritual healing. We get healed out there and we pray. It is the last place we have for our people." Indeed, Kitsatse and other proposed tribal protected areas are the few remaining places left where Denisah First Nations can still participate in biocultural activities as their ancestors did for thousands of years before they signed Treaty 8 with the Crown, activities that are crucial to maintaining their cultural and spiritual identity and connection to the land. Years of case law, as well as the 2014 Supreme Court case in Canada, it was known as the Chilcotin case, have drawn attention to the fact, and I mentioned this to the students this morning, that the treaty rights that Indigenous peoples have in Canada are effectively meaningless if you can't exercise them. So in other words, you may have treaty rights to hunt or fish or gather plants, but that treaty right is meaningless if there's not a landscape upon which you can exercise those treaty rights, because the caribou have disappeared, the moose have gone extinct, or the fish are poisoned. So the Canadian government must at least try to maintain those ecosystems that are critical to the rights that Indigenous nations have so that they can continue to live off healthy populations of wild game, fish, and plants. So in other words, there's actually an Indigenous right to have access to land. Now, why is this important? It is because of this reason that Indigenous peoples like the Denizah are exerting their sovereignty in protecting large swaths of their traditional territories as tribal parks or areas known as Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Now, Kitsatse is a little bit unique in that it's being established within an area where there's a pre-existing treaty between the Denizah and the Crown, Treaty 8. But the oldest Indigenous protected and conserved areas were actually established in places where no treaty exists. This is Mears Island Tribal Park. It was established by the Colloquiet First Nation unilaterally in 1984. Indigenous nations don't need the Crown to recognize their Indigenous protected and conserved area. The Colloquiet just did it because this ancient rainforest was going to be cut down and clear cut. More recently, there has been a proliferation of Indigenous peoples all across Canada and globally who are self-declaring Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Now, most of these IPCAs, or Indigenous protected and conserved areas, are solely Indigenous-led, and they're being governed and established under Indigenous laws and Indigenous systems of governance, sometimes referred to as natural law. So an example of that would be the Katmuk protected area, which is established by the Ktunaxa First Nation. But there are IPCAs that are being established as a consequence of partnership with colonial governments in Canada. So Taidenanene was established in the Northwest Territories. Iuichi was established in the Northwest Territories. Edeji was also established. These are all Indigenous protected areas that were actually established through a co-governance mechanism with the Government of Canada. In addition to IPCAs, Indigenous peoples are fostering innovation in other areas of biocultural stewardship. For me, one of the most exciting elements of conservation today has been the rise of what are called Indigenous guardians networks. This lady, her is named Valerie Courtois. She's Innu. She was just one of the people that was recognized by Time magazine as the most influential and inspiring people on the planet. There's also a lady, I believe, from Amazonia as well. I may have that wrong. Do you know her name?
Sonia Guajajak.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. So two of the Indigenous people have been recognized for their contribution to global conservation. Now, why are Indigenous protected and conserved areas and Indigenous guardians networks so important as a type of biocultural stewardship? For example, Indigenous guardians are guided by both Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science. They are involved in the monitoring of wildlife populations, assessing the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and communities. They conduct water testing, they track hunting and other activities on the land, and they carry out all types of research and stewardship in the management of their ancestral territories, including biocultural research. And I'll give you an example of what they are, but I'd let you hear from them directly.
The guardianship program is a huge step for us because it's about preserving the land, preserving culture, and preserving language. It's an essential thing to our community. A guardian acts as the eyes and ears in each respective territory. They ensure that everybody's following all the rules and regulations that are placed in all we laws, our laws.
We go out and monitor tourist activities, industry activities, fisheries, commercial and sport. We also do environmental monitoring.
A huge aspect of it is healing and getting back in touch with your Indigenous self. If there's healthy people that are happy and strong in their culture, and if they receive that from being on the land, then it's a huge investment. You're investing in a better society, a better tomorrow.
In 1973, I paddled on my own all the way down this kind of way. All my life, I always heard it as a very strong spiritual place. There's so much brush and debris and everything all over it when I got there. It just totally overgrown. So I took it upon myself to start clearing the village, just trying to show the ancestors that somebody did.
Our land is very important to us. We live on it, we breathe it, we work on it. It gives us life. Without it, we don't have an identity.
That's part of being a guardian, is being out on the land where your ancestors have lived for many centuries. And just to reconnect with Mother Nature and how your people lived off the land.
There's a gap between the youth and the elders. By starting this program and trying to bridge that gap, trying to create that spark to carry on the knowledge.
We are sustaining our traditional territory, not only for us, but for the whole world. Our ecosystem is so pure, we have so many trees that we are cleaning up a lot of pollution. It means that we are here protecting Mother Earth in order for the rest of the world to live on Earth.
So notice when you hear the guardians, I mean, they are talking about protecting biodiversity, but they're talking about other things. They're talking about revitalization of language. They're talking about trying to reconnect with elders, the severance between youth and elders. They're talking about reasserting their sovereignty. They're talking about nationhood. So this is what Indigenous-led conservation is. This is what is unique to Indigenous-led conservation and how it's different than state-led conservation. It goes way, way beyond the biological and ecological objectives of conservation. And to me, that is one of the reasons why it is one of the most promising forums for fostering biocultural approaches to conservation as well as biocultural education. Now, I want to touch about education because I think that's really important in terms of helping the University of Florida advance its very ambitious vision for engaging in biocultural scholarship and education. Indigenous Guardians networks inherently braid together Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. And they do this in the training of guardians. This is an innovation in biocultural education. As noted by Indigenous fisheries scientist Andrea Reed, Western science has not only taken precedence over Indigenous knowledge systems in conservation and other areas of public policy, but it has also tended to reinforce embedded power imbalances to the detriment of local communities. As Nassidi notes, quote, "This serves only to strengthen Western science for its own ends, and it concentrates power in administrative centers and academic institutions rather than Indigenous communities." We can't allow that to happen, right? We cannot engage in biocultural education if it's just going to simply strengthen power within our own institutions and not, in fact, give power to the communities from which this Indigenous knowledge, this biocultural knowledge emerges from. So the coexistence and complementarity of both Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems in the management of Indigenous protected and conserved areas and other types of Indigenous-led conservation is an important departure for how knowledge generation is typically employed by most of us in universities to inform conservation decision-making. The conservation sector, the conservation science sector, has to abandon the misguided notion that the necessary knowledge to recover endangered species or expertise needed in the day-to-day management of parks and protected areas is exclusively informed by the Western science and Western approaches to knowledge generation that we teach in the institutions. In recent years, Indigenous-led frameworks such as Two-Eyed Seeing that braid together both Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems have emerged and are being explicitly used to guide conservation activities, such as the management of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. One such conceptual framework is this idea of two-eyed seeing, which was developed by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall in 2004. He developed this conceptual framework for unifying knowledge systems, and Elder Marshall describes two-eyed seeing as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes for the benefit of all. Now, the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, as well as the resurgence in other types of biocultural stewardship activities, like Indigenous guardians, is happening within a colonial policy landscape that is changing in Canada and globally. So I'm going to start pivoting towards the end of my talk now. We're now at the global scale. In Canada, we're at the national scale. In Canada, the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process is a federal initiative that is meant to help Canada achieve its domestic and international targets to protect a minimum of 17% of terrestrial lands and waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas through networks of protected areas and what are referred to as other effective conservation measures. And this was supposed to have been achieved by 2020. It was not achieved by 2020. These targets have since been revised upwards, and now the target is that 30% of the planet will be protected by 2030 under new international conservation policy agreements, most notably the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, the Canada Pathway Target 1 process involves Indigenous peoples in Canada and commits to engaging both Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. As part of this process, the federal government worked with Indigenous peoples across the country to create something called the Indigenous Circle of Experts. They produced a groundbreaking report, which is called We Rise Together, and it articulates how Indigenous-led conservation can help governments achieve national conservation goals while advancing reconciliation among Indigenous peoples and settler Canadian institutions such as universities. The Indigenous Circle of Experts advocated for the advancement of Indigenous protected and conserved areas as both a conservation mechanism, but more importantly, as a tool to self-determination and sovereignty. According to the Indigenous Circle of Experts, Indigenous-led conservation areas must have 3 elements. Okay, they have to be Indigenous-led. They must represent long-term commitments to conservation, but most importantly, they must elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities. It's this third element that makes Indigenous-led conservation different than colonial parks and protected areas. The Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which my university is one of the founding members of, was established in 2018 to support Indigenous nations in implementing the Indigenous Circle of Experts report. And for yielding, I love this new word, which a student today shared with me, as opposed to uplifting, the idea of yielding outcomes that will essentially advance Indigenous-led stewardship of ancestral lands and waters according to traditional knowledge systems and their own forms of legal protocols and governance. The Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership is an Indigenous-led initiative. It's hosted by 2 Indigenous organizations in Canada. It's led by a 7-person leadership team. 5 of them are Indigenous knowledge holders, 2 are academics, I'm one of them. And it is supported by a national lodge of elders, which brought together knowledge holders from diverse geographies within Canada to provide cultural and spiritual guidance for the first half of the partnership, including research. The research actually began in ceremony and it's going to end in ceremony. That was really, really critical. Now, the work of the CRP includes biocultural and other types of research, as well as the creation of tools to help inform conservation and policy that recenters Indigenous knowledge systems, leadership rights, and responsibilities. It's going to end in 2026, but it's going to end with 3 legacy projects. The first is a digital archive of knowledge co-produced by Western scholars and Indigenous knowledge holders. Much of it is on biocultural education and biocultural research. The second are innovation centers. These are actually Indigenous-led campuses that are being established in Canada. One has already been established on the west coast of Vancouver Island. These are biocultural hubs where students can come and learn biocultural knowledge. It's land-based pedagogical methods, so students are learning on the land. And the third is an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas Political Alliance, recognizing that Indigenous peoples have to unite in support of their very ambitious vision. Now, why is this important? Well, it's very important because efforts by the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership and other Indigenous organizations to actively decolonize conservation is important because the establishment of protected areas and other colonial conservation models has long played a significant role in the displacement of Indigenous communities from traditional territory in Canada and around the world. It's happening right now in Kenya. It's happening right now in India, for example, where Indigenous peoples are being expelled from traditional territories to make way for tiger reserves and other wildlife areas. Studies after study has documented the alienation of Indigenous peoples from important food sources, cultural sites, and livelihood activities in the name of conservation. These negative social and ecological effects are linked to a particular colonial form of protected area, sometimes referred to as fortress conservation, which is rooted in notions of wilderness as being necessarily uninhabited and of management expertise, as I said earlier, being exclusively informed by Western science, and the idea that Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems are unequipped to manage for conservation values. Thus, it's fair to say that state-managed protected areas is very much a part of the fabric of colonialism because it has served as a means by which colonial and modern settler nation states have managed to establish and maintain control over Indigenous territory. Canada, in particular, struggles with a legacy of colonial conservation. Most of our most beloved national parks were established in places where Indigenous peoples were expelled, sometimes at gunpoint. I want to quote this Indigenous author here. It's a very interesting thing. Robert Jago, writing in the journal Walrus, writes that Canadian parks are colonial crime scenes. These are places that Canada has turned into parks, but they are filled with our own stories. Every mountain, every valley has a name and a history for Indigenous peoples. It is in these places that our history is alive. Our Mecca is there. Our Magna Carta is there. Our Thermopylae. And in his article, Walrus Jago gives numerous examples of how Indigenous peoples were moved off their lands to establish parks. The first national park in Canada, Banff National Park, was established by with a superintendent who was such a racist that he in fact banned Indigenous peoples from even being in the park. And the park was established within their traditional territories. Now, thankfully, things are beginning to shift. I'm going to be another 5 minutes if that's okay. The international conservation community has begun to recognize the often devastating effects of traditional conservation, most notably in the global biodiversity framework that was signed at COP15. This is very important for those of us that care very deeply about biocultural approaches to conservation, in part because 7 of the global biodiversity's 23 targets for policy action over the next decade explicitly reference Indigenous peoples and local communities. It references their rights, their traditional ecological knowledge, and their customary practices. So this gives us, in fact, a strengthened mandate to advocate for Indigenous-led conservation. As I've argued today, Indigenous peoples have been stewarding their lands and waters for thousands of years. Aboriginal rights jurisprudence in Canada and many other countries provides clear direction that Indigenous peoples need to be recognized and treated as decision makers, not as stakeholders. They are rights holders. They are not stakeholders. Indigenous peoples have political authority. They have title in many countries. They have land rights, and they have responsibilities, and they have effective laws, values, and knowledge systems that are critical to the success of conservation and enshrined within the biocultural paradigm. Thus, it's critically important that we develop meaningful relationships with Indigenous partners in advancing biocultural education. I want to end my talk by referencing one of your great American poets, Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder was once quoted as saying, quote, "The most radical thing you can do is stay home." Now, the phrase has come to mean lots of different things, but for me, it's a testament to the power of place and the profound relationships that Indigenous and local communities have with their land. I'm a botanist, so if you bear with me, I'm going to talk about botany for a second. The word radical originates from the Latin word for root or having roots. In botany, the radical is the first part of a seedling to emerge from the seed during germination. The radical is the embryonic root of the plant that grows downwards, anchoring the seed in the soil, thereby allowing the seed to suck up water and send out its leaves so that it can photosynthesize and give life. Indigenous peoples' relationship to land is not only ancient, but like a plant's radical, is deeply rooted in place and not easily removed, despite the legacy of colonialism and its harms on people and place. Thank you.